Okay, we're going to get started. People can still come in after their class, but we want to kick this off. Welcome to everyone. This is what we call a powerhouse duet here with us tonight. And I want to thank Walter Russell Mead and Lisa Anderson for participating. I want to thank the guests today, the audience. Thanks to Saltzman Institute for putting this together. Courtney, Pat, Ingrid, just always doing a fantastic job. I'm Stuart Gottlieb. I'll be moderating and hosting, double duty tonight. I teach here at SIPA. I teach U.S. foreign policy and international security. The organization for tonight is, in a minute or two, I'll turn it over to Walter, and he will speak about his new book, The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. So we'll get into that. Lisa will be able to respond with some remarks after Walter speaks for a little bit. Then we'll have some, hopefully, enlightened engagement between the two of them. I'll do some moderating on that. After that, we'll open it up for questions. I believe we have some potential web folks as well. Excellent. Just a quick bio on both of them. Walter Russell Mead, Ravenel B. Curry III Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute. He's also the James Clarke Chace Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, and the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, which I consider a must-read column. Between 2003 and 2010, Walter was the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's currently a member of Aspen Institute, Italy. He's also the author of several other very special books, including Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, as well as God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World. He doesn't ever pick up any really big topics, you know. Lisa Anderson, speaking of special, is special lecturer and James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations, Emerita at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where we are right now. Lisa served as both provost and president of the American University in Cairo between 2008 and 2016. That was after she served for a long period of time here at Columbia as dean of the School of International and Public Affairs between 1997 and 2007, where she also served as on my dissertation committee, if I recall correctly. And she did, and she was on faculty at the Political Science Department as well, where she still is. Dr. Anderson is a Middle East and North Africa expert. She had a landmark book, The State and Social Transformation in Tunisia and Libya, and also the author of too many scholarly articles to mention at the moment. So I want to welcome both of them. Thanks for coming. And I just wanted just a couple of quick words on my end before I turn it over to the duet. I read through this book. I didn't think I was going to read the entire thing during the end of the semester and finals, but I did because it was that riveting. It's a very broad and comprehensive historical sweep, very elegantly written, a total page turner, which is rare for these books of international relations and history generally. I've been teaching U.S. foreign policy here for going on 20 years. Yes, Lisa, it has been that long. And I found the middle chapters on the Truman foreign policy to be one of the most riveting I've ever read. Blow-by-blow accounts of real-world American foreign policy making. I believe it would make an excellent Netflix miniseries. The only question is who would play Eleanor Roosevelt. Very rare. I struggled to find a negative review, and I haven't at this point. Just rave reviews from the New Republic to the New York Times to the Atlantic to the Washington Post, all using terms like magisterial and landmark. I'll just quote a quick one from the Washington Post. I think it summed up my feeling on this. Also called it magisterial, quoting, "Any careful reader will come away from this book armed with facts, history, and context, and with a clarity absent from most discussions of the subject," unquote. So very much a landmark book. I highly recommend it. If you should read it, if only you want to find out who the Vulcanists are and what a MacGuffin is, among other things that are interesting in this book. Just a real quick personal note. I have a somewhat unique vantage point regarding many of the issues and themes covered in this book. In 1999, I went to work for an incoming senator named Charles Schumer from New York as his foreign policy advisor. He was at that point a junior senator from New York underneath a towering senior senator named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan was the lead Democratic sponsor of a 1995 law known as the Jerusalem Embassy Act, which required the United States to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by the end of 1999. The lead Republican sponsor was Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole from Kansas, which is that eclectic political mix that Walter gets into in his book. Anyway, the law had passed with overwhelming veto-proof bipartisan majorities, but under pressure from the Clinton State Department, the law was kind of forced to include a national security waiver for up to 6 months, a presidential national security waiver, which since 1999 every president until Donald Trump had utilized. The State Department made the argument that it was going to hamstring the Palestinian-Israeli peace process. Long story short, Moynihan retires in 2000, and Schumer becomes the senior senator from New York and took over from Moynihan the lead role in and kind of muscled his way in as a very, first-term senator to become the lead Democrat on what they wanted to now be a new law that got rid of the national security waiver. And John Kyle was his co-sponsor, again from Arizona, this interesting mix of politics. And so the State Department was going crazy, and I became the State Department's new best friend because they were worried about a new law being passed with no national security waiver. In spring of 2001, I traveled to Israel with Schumer, and we were looking at potential sites for the new embassy. And the Schumer-Kyle bill that was going to be presented before Congress was working on a new piece of legislation without a presidential waiver. So that was all going on during, you might remember, the second Intifada in spring of 2001. Walter gets into this in some detail. So it was a very tumultuous time in the Middle East. And just a few months later, 9/11 happened, and history just started moving really fast. At that point. But that's where we were on the Jerusalem Embassy Act by the time of essentially 9/11. Exactly 1 year earlier, I was there on a congressional delegation at the last legs of the Oslo peace process. That was the Holy Grail they were searching for. They were measuring the final borders between Syria and Israel up to inches when we were there. We were meeting in Ramallah, Palestinians, Israelis, a very nice time in history, we thought, and then a year later, it just all collapsed. And then 9/11 happened. And my final point is, having worked in the Senate between 99 and the end of 2003, after 3 years with Schumer, I went to work for Senator Dodd on the Foreign Relations Committee. I got to know many senior Israeli officials and also, obviously, many senior lobbyists. And they were not shy about what they understood as threats to Israel's core strategic interests. So after working in Washington for 5 years, I started reading leading academics and others blaming U.S. foreign policy X or U.S. foreign policy Y all around that time when I was there, solely on the Israel lobby. It was a little disconcerting. These things were often divorced from actual Israeli strategic thinking and often divorced from how U.S. foreign policy is actually made. So I was very interested to read Walter's account of this stuff. He deals with this in a very detailed and sophisticated way that, as we've come to expect from all of his work. And this book, as much as any, I just found to be brilliant, if you don't mind me using that word.
No, I don't.
No, I didn't think you were blushing too much through this, but I mean everything I just said. Very amazing book. That's why it's getting the rave reviews it's getting out there. I definitely recommend it to everybody. So let me turn it over to Walter for a bit, and then over to Lisa. Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm not really sure I've got much to say after that. This is, writing a book about the U.S.-Israel relationship is one of those tasks that it takes, either a lot of stupidity or a lot of ignorance to take on. I mean, it's a tough subject. You've got a lot of people on all sides that are ready to kind of come at you in various ways. You didn't say enough about this. You didn't talk enough about how these people are just unspeakably horrible, whatever. You know, it just, it's one of these subjects that just minefields are all over it. But for me, there was a special kind of appeal. There's a reason I really wanted to write about this that actually is not directly about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in some ways even about U.S.-Israel policy. It's that as somebody who, by training, is a generalist. That is, I don't actually have a PhD or even a master's degree, so I may well be the least qualified person in this room. But what I want, but that doesn't mean I just kind of sat around and watched TV. I wanted to keep going and continue the liberal arts education past my 4 years of undergrad college, or in my case, because I was a little slow about things, my 6 years in undergraduate college. And have always wanted to learn about the world, learn outside of disciplines, very much grounded in history and in an understanding of culture. And rather than being a regional specialist or a country specialist or an issue specialist, I've really tried to develop a specialist depth understanding of the way different issues and different regions fit together, and in particular, against a background of American foreign policy, which is global whether we want it to be or not. And the subject of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the place of American Jews in the United States, those two subjects which really drive this book, felt to me like it was an ideal subject to bring in this kind of generalist perspective. I mean, I was going to have to write about the origins of Western anti-Semitism in sort of the medieval church, the cultural developments in the Reformation and in early modern Britain and the U.S. that sort of desacralized the state and society and made and created a different kind of opening for Jews in those societies. The national movement of Zionism, but in the context of the nationalisms of Europe and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th century. And I think, and it's just this led, and then on American immigration policy, the politics around Israel, American foreign policy, particularly under Truman. And I found as I did this and tried to apply this generalist frame to these subjects, I kept seeing things that I'd never seen before and that I think maybe a lot of other people hadn't seen either. The book, to me, was full of surprises. One would be that the single most important contribution that the United States ever made to the foundation of the State of Israel was the decision to block migration from Europe in 1924. Had the U.S. not essentially cut immigration 90% in 1924, I really don't think there would have ever been enough Jews in British Palestine to form a state in Israel. Now, at the same time, there might have been many fewer Jews stuck in Europe at the time of the Holocaust. But this, to me, illustrates, in a sense, the way that a history that we often read retrospectively as being determined, that we try to look through, is American policy pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, how do these work? If you really look at the context in which a lot of these things happen, it looked very different to observers. I also was surprised to see the extent to which some of the contemporary divisions among American Jews about Israel and about American policy toward Israel really reflect deep historical roots. American Jewish community was anti-Zionist, majority anti-Zionist, well into the 20th century. It was the leadership of the American Jewish community doesn't really embrace Zionism until World War II, until the Holocaust is actually underway. And the support for Israel in the United States in the 1940s and 50s was a left-wing cause. The Democratic Socialists of America, who today are not noted for their support for Israel, the DSA actually was using Israel as the poster child for socialism, because Israel was far more left-wing, far more centrally planned, far more state-owned as an economy in the 1950s than any of the West European social democracies. And so when people would say, socialism, you have no democracy, the Democratic Socialists of America and others would say, no, there's Israel. And they would say, well, socialist country can't have a good economy. Well, there's Israel. Yeah, they're not rich, but look at all the immigrants and the refugees that they're absorbing. It's amazing. And they still have enough money to defend themselves. And so Israel was the great hope of the secular left in the 1950s. Another, I think probably, though, the thing that stays with me as I try to think about modern American policy toward Israel is that actually, somewhat to my surprise, its best realism best explains the history of the American-Israel relationship. Much better, obviously, than the kind of Israel lobby thesis, I think. And much better than sort of, our love for the other democracy, for the democracy in the Middle East, this kind of thing. In the 1940s and 50s, when Israel was desperately poor and much more insecure than it would later become, the United States wasn't helping Israel at all. In fact, Israel couldn't buy American weapons for cash during most of that period. We'd simply not sell them weapons. The goal of American policy in the Eisenhower administration, and to some degree even in the later years of Truman, was not to help Israel or defend Israel. It was to build a relationship with Nasser, because Nasser was seen as one of the kind of modernizing military figures in developing countries who was nationalist, who could be the foundation of an anti-Soviet alliance. And so getting kind of showing Nasser that a relationship with America would help build up Egypt as a nation better than the Soviet Union could do, build the economy, build the society, that was the focus, much more than any focus on Israel. And the Eisenhower administration was actually willing to push Israel to give up the Negev in the hope of gaining support for its policies and getting Arab support for peace with Israel. Israel, as I say in the book, Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance after it had grown strong. And so it's in the 1970s when, for Nixon and Kissinger, Israel becomes an asset in their competition with the Soviet Union, that the U.S. shifts toward Israel as an ally. It was also the case, though, that the Israeli development of nuclear weapons played more of a role in the developing American relationship. John F. Kennedy was the first president to use the phrase special relationship in talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship. And this was part of he was hoping to persuade Ben-Gurion to give up his nuclear weapons program. And he understood that the Israelis would never do this unless they felt secure, unless they felt that Americans would secure them. So he began to kind of play up America's willingness to stand by Israel and even offer Israel more sophisticated weapons as part of this effort. But in the same way, when Nixon and Kissinger make the decision to resupply Israel's arms during the Yom Kippur War, at the back of their minds was the reality, the world is having an oil shortage, OPEC is jacking up the prices, the U.S. needs this oil. Israel, if it starts losing the war to Egypt and Syria and is running short of material to fight it, they're not going to sit there and die and accept a loss. They would use their nuclear weapons before then. This would not be good for the international oil market, can I say? And so and if you track the relationships ever since, you can see that the ups and downs are much more closely aligned to the perceptions of the national interest in Washington than other considerations. Perceptions, I say, because presidents are sometimes quite wrong about what the national interest is. People do get it wrong, but if you want to understand how they think about Israel, if you understand how they think about the world, and if you understand how the Middle East fits into their picture of American interests globally, and then how Israel fits into their picture of the Middle East, there are not that many surprises in the record of American-Israel relations. Something else I think that struck me in this work is that the United States has less responsibility for Israel, and the Israelis have never quite viewed the Americans the way the Americans like to see the relationship. There is a sort of this idea that Harry Truman was a myth maker who really worked on this myth, that Harry Truman liked to think of himself as Cyrus, the modern Cyrus who brings the chosen people back to the Holy Land, and this was a great accomplishment. It was clear to me from what I read that Joseph Stalin had a lot more to do with Israel's drive for independence than Harry Truman did. Truman actually never formally called for Israeli independence on his own. He, at the last thing that the Israeli cabinet did before it voted to declare independence in May of 1948, was it rejected the Truman administration's request to delay independence in order to give the Truman administration more time to try to extend the UN mandate and continue negotiations. Israel begins by buying weapons from Czechoslovakia, which at that time was a Stalinist puppet. That money helped the Soviets and the communists in Czechoslovakia secure their power in Czechoslovakia, which was directly contrary to American policy at the time. As far as we can tell, as far as we were able to tell in the research, the Truman administration didn't know about Stalin's arms deals with Israel, but they smelled a rat in there somewhere. They knew there was something in that relationship that was not right. And I think a lot of the State Department's and CIA's later hostility to Israel probably is related to their discovery of what the Israelis were up to in the spring of 1948. I think I also discovered that if there should be a statue to any American in Israel, it should probably be to Eleanor Roosevelt. Her lobbying of Harry Truman probably had significantly more to do with the Truman administration policy toward Israel than anything actually that the American Jewish community managed to do, and it was significant. And her support on humanitarian grounds for the Jews of Palestine was steady, gained in strength, and once she got hold of it, she never let go. So that was an interesting discovery. I did not make policy recommendations in this. It's a wonderful thing. If you ever work for a think tank, what you'll find is that the bureaucracy in the think tank wants you to make it all about policy recommendations. The reality of publishing is that by the time this thing goes through the internal process at the think tank and then goes through the publishing thing, it's going to be, a year is going to take place between when you finish writing and when the book comes out. Very few policy recommendations can stand even that little time, just because the situation, not because everyone is wrong, but because the situation changes, and you would advise something different with the same information and the same values. You would advise something different under these different conditions. So basically, it's a conspiracy to make books worthless. I'm happy to have escaped that. Maybe I'll just finally say that the two drivers, as far as I can see, in American policy toward Israel are first and foremost the American national interest as presidents and secretaries of state understand it at various times. And they obviously bring varying degrees of clarity and varying degrees of sophistication to that analysis. And the other is, in a sense, because Israel is rarely that important in the great scheme of things to American foreign policy, but is quite salient in terms of domestic politics, presidents find Israel policy an extremely useful way to communicate with the public about their foreign policy overall, to signal the kind of policy. So if a president wants to signal, boy, I'm a hawk and I'm going to take a tough stand on terrorism and so on, I'm going to, you go to Jerusalem and you give a speech. Or if you want to say, I'm a sophisticated citizen of the world and I want to get away from some of these old polarizations and so on, you put a little bit of pressure on the Israelis about something connected with the Palestinians. And you get a bunch of people going, oh, I wish you'd do more, but this is so nice. So it's an issue that allows you as a political leader to tell voters who are normally not interested in foreign policy particularly. They're more interested in Israel than they are in other foreign policies. So it can be a kind of a showcase for whatever it is you want to communicate. And I think we do see presidents using it that way, but it's conditioned by their sense of the national interest. I won't run on forever. The book is long enough, and you can all read it if you wish. But I think I'll give you something that's very long term that I think is interesting. In 1891, President Benjamin Harrison is peacefully sitting in the White House one day. I don't think he had the resolute desk, because I don't think the British had maybe they had just given it to us. I can't remember. But anyway, he's peacefully sitting at his desk, and in comes his Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, with this petition. And the petition asks him to use America's influence to get the Europeans to use their influence to get the Ottoman Sultan to declare a Jewish national home in Ottoman Palestine. This petition is signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was William McKinley, would go on to be president, a galaxy of religious, journalistic, cultural leaders from the entire American establishment. American Jews are conspicuous by their absence from this petition. This was known as the Blackstone Memorial. And given who signs it, the president who signed it, the president, oh, this is very interesting, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. And then he hands it off to the State Department. And the State Department then buries it so deeply that actually the original copy is still lost. When Louis Brandeis heard about this later and he found William Blackstone, they had to get a copy from Blackstone's personal archives and bring it back up. But there, in some ways, you see, I think, a perpetual thing in American foreign policy. Public opinion, by and large, may not know the details, but it likes the idea of a Jewish state in the land of the Bible. And the public out there is kind of for it. In general, Congress, as the branch of government that is closest to public opinion, tends to be more pro-Israel. The State Department and the permanent bureaucracy tends to be much more skeptical and really doesn't want anything to do, thinks life is complicated enough already. Why are you giving me this? Is kind of the fundamental approach. And presidents oscillating, who are, feel the tug of public opinion in politics, but also know that they've got to pay some attention to these other forces out there. They tend to be kind of the arbiters in American politics between those two forces. And that, I think, you can see with some clarity from 1891 more or less on up to the present day. The other thing that is interesting is what's unique about the modern American approach to Israel is not that the left was once very pro-Israel and then became less so. That's actually the pattern throughout Western Europe and Canada as well. Again, Israel was more popular in Western Europe in the 1950s than it was in the United States. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the Europeans were very pro-Israel. In 1967, at the start of the war, tens of thousands of students went to the Israeli embassy in Bonn, in Germany. They were offering to go to Israel to do non-combatant work to release more Israelis to get to the battlefront. Now, if a war started in the Middle East today, I think, again, tens of thousands of Germans would come down to march on the Israeli embassy, but I'm not sure the message would be the same. And the same thing happened in Paris. Very similar things happened in Paris. So the reasons why Israel gradually lost its hold on the left, it's a complicated story. There are many pieces to it, and it's a little bit different in each country, but it is a story. In general, it has happened more slowly in the United States than happened in Europe, and hasn't gone as far in the United States as it's gone in Europe, although, again, with some people it's gone pretty far. But in the Democratic Party at large, it has not moved the way, say, some of the social democratic parties in Europe has done. You might say, that's interesting. But again, in general, in America, the left has moved less far on a whole lot of things than it has in a lot of Europe. This pattern is not, the pattern of what's happened in the American left is not particularly exceptional when we look at the general pattern of how this operates. What is obviously unusual is the American right, which was not particularly pro-Israel back in the 40s and 50s. The Southern Baptist Conference actually refused to send a telegram of congratulations to Harry Truman, congratulating him on his recognition of Israel in 1948. Possibly because they were sick of him over civil rights and didn't want to make him look good. But in any case, it's just an interesting point to raise. And it's not until the late 70s, early 80s that Israel becomes a kind of not even just a common thing on the right, but almost one of the great symbols of Reagan republicanism is strong U.S. identification with and support of Israel. So trying to understand how that happened on the American right. And then, of course, how Trump's disruption of the American right. Then, how does Trump stand on Israel? And obviously his very complex views on anti-Semitism, which we learn more about every day. Where does that coming from? And I think to some degree in the book I figured some of that out, but I will leave it to you to take a look and see. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I did very much enjoy reading this book. It is, as is all of his work, exceptionally well written. And Stuart may have taken it to the beach. I didn't quite go that far, but it is a really wonderful, fun thing to read. So I commend it, if only for that. But I want to talk about two things that I found striking about the book. One of which is, it really is about the United States. And it's a way of understanding American history and the history of American foreign policy making through a particular lens. Presumably, in a sense, you could do this about China. You could have a lens of understanding how the United States has worked from thinking about its policies toward China. And so in that sense, it is, obviously I wouldn't be here if China were the country. It is particularly interesting from my vantage point that it's Israel is the lens in. But it's not a story about Israel. It's a story about the United States. And I think it's, from that vantage point, you see things about the United States, including this memo from the end of the 19th century, a kind of way of understanding before the United States becomes a global power, who was involved, who presidents listened to, what kinds of things they were advocating and why, and so forth and so on. So you see this, it's a very, very revealing story, I think, about the United States. And so I'd like to, I'm going to say a few things and then I hope you'll respond to that. But I think, whether it's the 19th century Jewish question in the United States as opposed to Europe, or whether it's the development of Zionism in the United States as opposed to Europe, or whether it's policy toward Israel after Israel is created in American policy, all the way through, these are really questions about how the United States works. And I think it's very revealing, and it does give you a lens through which to understand the United States, which I think is unusual and revealing. But it does mean that there are certain kinds of things that, because it's not about Israel, you could interpret differently. So the last things you were talking about the shift in the left-right support for Israel. Well, the election of the Likud government and the subsequent policies actually matter. It's not just that somehow the left got disenchanted and the right got more enchanted. Israel changed. So, which it's not that it's not in the book, but the focus of this being about the United States means that Israel, in a sense, is a proxy. It is something that U.S. presidents will use as a vehicle for describing other sorts of things. It doesn't have the same kind of capacity for change that the United States has in the book. Which, again, since in my view it is about the United States, that's fine. But it does mean sometimes you sort of gloss over a little bit the fact that Israel itself is becoming a different kind of place, and that would be reflected in a bilateral relationship. So I want to accent the fact that I think it is a really interesting lens to understand the United States, but it's about the United States. Which means that I would have, so my first question is, I'm sure the publishers gave you the title, but where is the fate of the Jewish people in the story? You have the United States, Israel, and the fate of the Jewish people. It's not clear to me where that, sort of sits in the book itself. So that's one thing. The second thing is something you didn't mention in your remarks, and I think it's so wonderful that I want everybody to read these parts. There's a really, in some ways, I think this is the loveliest language in the book, is the discussion of what Israel means to the various Christian communities, particularly the evangelicals after the Second World War. You have a discussion there that's really, I think it's the best thing I've ever read about that. It's very sort of, and it's empathetic. It really is. And I'm probably one of the very few people in this building that have read any of the Left Behind series. And I think it's just, you should talk about that, at least here. And it's just a really very powerful discussion of why there is Christian Zionism and how Christian Zionism works. And I think it's, it is part of the most it's some of the most interesting parts of the book are there. But I don't see it connected to your pretty realpolitik, the president is going to have policy on the basis of national interests, and sometimes they make mistakes and so forth and so on. So there are almost two levels of analysis. One is the sort of cultural, right, and the other is a very kind of, as I say, sort of pragmatic realpolitik. And I'd love to hear you, first of all, I think you should explain to people a little bit more about the Christian Zionism, just because I think it's so well done. But then also a little bit how that connects to the, making the policy at any given point. So those, again, I thought it was obviously quite a lot of fun, very provocative.
Well, thanks. Those are really great comments and extremely perceptive.
I'll take that. So Stuart says you're brilliant, and you say I'm perceptive, and we can leave now.
Right, exactly. We're a very happy group up here. I don't know about you guys, but we're doing fine. Look, let me start. Yeah, this is obviously, it's a book about America, and it's a book about how America encounters the world through this lens of Israel. I think if I were to write another one of these books, and I'm not sure I have it in me, it would be actually about the U.S. and Britain in the same, using the same sets of analysis. And I actually think it would be fascinating. If I were 30 years younger, I would do it in a heartbeat.
You listening? Somebody needs to do this book.
It's a great book. A few people have taken stabs at it, but nobody, I think, it is the book. Slight digression here, but American historians are the last isolationists in the sense that they tend to write American history as if it's just a bunch of Americans running around. So, if you read about New England transcendentalism, what you won't get from there is that they're getting it from people like Coleridge, that like the big day for Emerson is he goes to England and they take him seriously. And this is... Or
the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yes. Yeah, they're reading this stuff and thinking about it tremendously. They're often, they begin by reading the German Romantics through the English Romantics, and then a few of them start reading German on their own. But there's a constant back and forth here. And political events are affecting them. The Hungarian Revolution was a huge fact, a major force in American life. The wars of the Italian Risorgimento. So if any of you think you want to be a historian and want to do something interesting and fresh, the United States in context, American history in context. And I was actually just talking about Europe. That is far from the only context that matters to Americans, even in the 18th and 19th century. But on to your, as far as like Israel changes with the Likud government, obviously this had a lot to do with some of the, basically when Israel goes from being a poster child for democratic socialism to being a poster child for Thatcherism, this does change Israel's appeal in some ways. And it does have an impact. I actually think labor, the left in Israel has used this in a very sophisticated way, because on questions of security in the Palestinians, the difference between Labor and Likud has generally been less than Labor would like people to think. And so Labor has actually kind of camouflaged some of its own policies, and but what they also don't. One of the things that's changed in Israel, one of the reasons this is just such a complicated subject, is the more liberal and left Israelis tend to be the Israelis of Jewish origin, the Ashkenazi, and the more right-wing and much more hardline on Arab and security issues tend to be, though not, we're generalizing here, the Mizrahi, the Jews who are descended from Middle Eastern Jews, many of whom were literally driven out of their homes in the 40s and 50s by Arabs, in part in response to what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. But these Jews who are exiles in their own thinking, they look at, everyone is crying for the Palestinians and giving the money. Where's my UNRWA check? Where's my compensation? Where's my... They don't feel any sense of guilt or obligation or historical debt to the Palestinians at all. They see themselves actually as victims, first of the Arabs, and then of the irritating Ashkenazi, who then put them in the second-class camps in Israel and don't give them the good jobs and blah, 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 blah. And this, by the way, is Netanyahu is Ashkenazi, but he's managed to sort of insert himself as the kind of symbolic leader of this group. So as the less European, more third world, more Middle Eastern Jews come to the fore in Israel, Israel becomes a less sympathetic object for American and European liberals. So, but again, what is distinctive in some ways is that the American right has embraced Israel in a way that some pieces of the European right have, but not nearly to the same degree.
Walter, just real quick, one thing was the '67 war also, and when Israel became an occupying power, and you make some great connections between Israel and the Western Enlightenment, and at that point, Lisa, things sort of changed in terms of the view from Europe about Israel,
right,
and many people in the United States, and
right,
so that was playing a role too.
Well, also the fact that in Europe some of the 50s support for Israel was linked to European imperial adventures and colonization efforts in the Middle East, so that France's support for Israel was linked to France's support, attempt to maintain Algeria as a French colony. So there were sort of a lot of intergenerational and political dynamics in Europe that you don't get here. Fate of the Jewish people. Why is that in the title? Well, as you say, publishers do titles. The worst thing that ever happened to me in that way, I don't know, some of you may have heard of this, it was in the news a little bit, is that some guy at the Wall Street Journal stuck the headline, "China's Sick Man of Asia," on top of one of my columns. The Chinese Foreign Ministry denounced me as a racist and launched an international campaign to destroy me. Thankfully, I've survived this assault, and I'm here to... In fact, I just had a very lovely 9-course lunch with the Chinese Deputy Chief of Mission.
So I guess you're forgiven.
She didn't say so, but it was a lovely lunch, and I didn't feel ill afterwards. So, anyway, but so that was the worst trouble I ever got in with a headline. But it does. I think it does deal with the fact that the Jewish people entered a bit earlier what all people have entered, and this connects, I think, with your second question in a way. an apocalyptic era, not defined as an era when the Messiah is about to return, but when your society, maybe your species, your nation, faces an existential peril every day, where your survival is on the table. For humanity as a whole, sort of after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we have that sense of living in an apocalyptic era. When we think of apocalypse, used to be a religious mythological concept that the gods would rain down fire and destruction at some point in the future, or the Messiah would come and change everything, whatever. But this was a divine activity. In the 20th century, we had to live with the idea that the actual human history could produce the destruction of all human life. And this, in the Enlightenment, we formed the idea that human activity and intentional human activity could create utopia. So we now live in the world where we think, on the one hand, that politics could bring about an earthly utopia where it's justice and freedom and safety and peace and abundance for everyone, or literally the destruction of the human race. So I'd say we have not so much secularized in the sense of driving religion out of our political life. We've sacralized politics, okay? And for the Jewish people, Zionism is a form of this. Theologically, most Orthodox Jews rejected the idea of Zionism in the 19th, indeed for much of the 20th century. Some still do today, on the grounds that the return of just as the exile of the Jews from the Holy Land was a divine action, so the return of the Jews must be by divine action and divine plan. And when the Messiah, the anointed one, comes, God's messenger, then he will restore the Jews. And so for humanity to try to interfere with this is blasphemous. But when you take on this religious apocalyptic project as a political project that you actually then start organizing to achieve, you see what I mean? You are elevating ordinary politics almost into this mythological realm. Why do I say almost? Into this mythological realm. All right? And in that sense, Zionism is not so different from communism, which is was an organized effort to build a utopia on earth through intentional political action. All right? So we have these, and liberalism is fundamentally, when people talk about a liberal world order bringing peace and abundance to everybody, this is also an apocalyptic project. So that's really where I'm coming to. And then when you have, the Holocaust, Zionism, and America, three of these enormously different things that the Jewish people go through in the 20th century, I think it's justified in that sense.
Oh, that's good.
But let's get back to this apocalypse thing, because I think this gets back to your question about Christian Zionism and so on. And I believe it's important to understand that that first of all, the last 75 years have been the most, from a sort of conversion and expansion point of view, the most successful 75 years in Christian history. That sub-Saharan Africa in 1950 had only a very tiny number of Christians, most of whom were either Ethiopian or white South African. And today there are 350 or more Christians in sub-Saharan Africa. American Christianity in particular, you look at the rise of Pentecostalism and so on in places like Brazil, throughout Latin America. South Korea has become essentially majority Christian since 1950. It's an extraordinary thing, but in America too, we always have this kind of image in our head that America every country starts out very religious and then gradually and inexorably secularizes. America was probably more religiously observant, and a higher percentage of people belonged to religious bodies from the 1960s to the 1990s than in any other period in our history. It was really quite extraordinary. What does Israel have to do with this? The answer is, beginning back in Puritan Boston, there's a tradition in American Christianity, the theological tradition that holds that the Bible predicts, prophetic books of the Old Testament and some things in the New Testament predict that as history approaches its climax, the Jews will return to the lands of the Bible. Cotton Mather preached this in Boston, Sir Isaac Newton, John Milton. There's a sort of a history in kind of Calvinist, Puritan world about this idea. And it continues in America. And it's not just a sort of conservative Christian idea. It becomes also a very liberal, optimistic idea that the return of the Jews is a sign of a positive, that history is moving in the right direction, and this will be one of the things that marks it. Frankly, this is one of the reasons I think that Eleanor Roosevelt and so many of the sort of early UN supporters were so enthusiastic. The first decision, big decision, that the UN is called on to make is restoring the Jews, a Jewish state. That had an immense impact on people. But think about this. It's 1944, and the Soviet troops break into Poland and start liberating the extermination camps. And up until then, there had been newspaper stories about something terrible happening to the Jews of Europe. So suddenly, though, now you've got newsreel footage. You've got survivor testimony. And believe me, Stalin's cameramen and Stalin's propaganda apparatus is there, making sure that everybody sees what the Nazis have been up to, especially because we want to suppress any stories about certain massacres of Polish officers that might, but the atrocity propaganda is huge. And of course, it was an atrocity. So, hits like a hammer. And where does it hit? It hits at that Enlightenment faith that science, reason, technology, culture can elevate humanity's morality, right? That, okay, yes, in the Dark Ages we did terrible things to each other, and there were the Huns and the Mongols and terrible crimes and viciousness, but that's all in the past. Because thanks to the Enlightenment, thanks to modern culture, technology, science, affluence, we're past that now. We're moving on to a new kind of world. Better people in a better world. The problem is, Germany was the most enlightened country in Europe by many standards. The philosophy, the poetry, the music, the general culture and civilizational level was extraordinary. And so the acme of European culture and enlightenment produces a crime of just the most horrific proportions. So where is this moral progress? And even those who don't commit it kind of stand back. All right, where's the moral progress? Are we as bad as, is there something in us as a species that's just dark and isn't changing? Next thing that happens, 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And this animal with this dark tendency has now gotten its hands on the power to exterminate life on Earth. Okay. This is apocalypse. And there are no guarantees. What's the guarantee that we won't do it? That a Hitler in his bunker or a Kim Jong-un or some crazy person won't start it. There isn't any guarantee. Nobody can give you a guarantee. And I think actually human civilization, we've all been in this since 1945. After 1989, it kind of faded a bit. And that's one reason for that huge exuberance end of history, was the feeling this cloud might be dissipating, but we know better now. Or I could say we know worse now. And in fact, today, it's not just that we could destroy ourselves in an act of commission with nuclear weapons. We could destroy ourselves in acts of omission by failing to deal with climate change or other things. That the sacralization, the apocalypticization of politics has continued to deepen and is something that affects all of us in all kinds of ways that we may not even be conscious of, but are real. Well, then what happens in 1948, Israel declares independence, and against all what the military experts predict, they win. Now, for all of those Americans who've had this, whether they're fundamentalists or liberal Protestants or whatever, have this grounding not only in the Bible as a cultural phenomenon, but this tradition of the Bible predicting the return of the Jews to the promised land. This is like, whoa, God is there. All right? History holds no hope. Humanity is broken, and humanity has the power to destroy itself. Okay? Billy Graham's first big revival is in Los Angeles the week that the Soviet nuclear test is revealed. And, so now, the ultimate evil has the ultimate weapon. There is no hope in history, but there is hope in God. And Israel, the existence of Israel, is your proof in front of you that there is God. And God is watching history, and He's in charge. You may not understand, may not make any sense to you at all, but there it is, written in letters of fire 40 feet high. All right? And, you'd had the biblical criticism, the people saying, oh, well, Isaiah, yes, he prophesied this, he prophesied that, but really the book was connected over 150 years. There are many different authors. This is true, maybe, but none of those authors were after 1948. All right? They were all, the latest date you're going to get is like 400 BCE. All right? That's still pretty futuristic. All right? So this sense that in a world of chaos, despair, imminent possible destruction of everything you know and care about, Israel as a sign of hope. I don't think you can understand American public attitudes toward Israel without getting a sense of the weight of that on people. And then you get to the somewhat depressing question, possibly, that we have these two levels of analysis in the book, realpolitik and culture politik, and they don't always intersect very clearly, because it does seem to it is clear that popular views of Israel, some positive, some negative, popular views of Jews and who they are, what they want, what they do, influence public opinion on policy questions. And politicians have to take these things into account when they make policy. But politicians also have to take into account this annoying thing called the external world, that much as we might all like for American foreign policy simply to be a psychodrama taking place inside the heads of the American people, there's actually something out there that bites back. And so you have to, and you have to deal with that. Where I come down to, I think, on this is that, and I try to get to this by looking at the formation of these different kinds of strategic consensuses that mark the 20th century, how since the end of World War I, I think you can identify several different American foreign policy consensus. People will often talk about the Cold War consensus, but I think you can add to that. There was what I call the Lodge consensus between 1920 and 1940 that was isolationist in some ways, but actually in others was interventionist. It was somewhat idealistic, somewhat real. It was a mix, but it seemed to people of that generation that there was a way of thinking about the external world that made sense both in terms of external politics and in terms of American cultural values. And so this is where it seems to me that those things are linked in the formation of these mindsets that then tell you, well, is the Middle East important to me, and if so, why? Is democracy in the Middle East important to me, and if so, why? So I think that's how they go together. But it does mean, I think, that politicians in the moment execute, thinking they're executing something kind of realpolitik. But their idea of what realpolitik is formed by these, can't be understood apart from these cultural things. But I would not call myself kind of a full-fledged deep constructivist here, because I think reality still does bite back. And so you can't simply make up the world that you would like to live in and then live in that world and everything conforms to you. Even if you're a very great power, you can't do that. So it's messy, and things interpenetrate with each other. And again, as I say, part of the realpolitik of Israel policy is this signaling function.
Yeah. Lisa, you want to respond, and then we'll open up for some questions?
We should, yeah.
Good, that's terrific. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful.
If anybody has a question, maybe you come right. You don't mind walking up to the microphone and just identify.
Press the button on the top and turn it off.
And then just identify. We'll get to everybody. And then please identify yourselves.
Hi, is this on? Yeah, that's on. Okay. My name's Gabrielle. I'm actually an undergrad. So you saying you're a generalist and you're like only an undergrad, super inspiring. Thank you. So my question for you is about this like cultural stuff that you're talking about. I think it's really interesting, and I didn't know the stuff about the Bible and like the evangelicals and how that would create a sense of Zionism within a community that like you would maybe not expect. So my question is, how does pop culture pick up on that narrative? Like you might see films like Exodus and also Ben-Hur and like all these biblical films that come out in the 50s and just generally in the golden age of Hollywood. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that pop culture forms the kind of general opinion that you said, like about, what did you say? About the idea of the Jewish state in the land of the Bible. Like how does pop culture build on that?
It's very interesting that Exodus was which had Paul Newman in it, wins an Oscar. It's a very, very pro-Israel film. And it was the first film that one of the Hollywood 10 wrote under their own name afterwards. And this is all part of the left's romance with Israel, that to some degree, the left was quite consciously working in the 50s to create a positive image of Israel and of the Jewish people. And this was again, part of what, there's a kind of a pre-existing sense here that in European culture, and some degree even in American culture in the 19th, early 20th century, religious conservatives, by and large Christian obviously, tended to be anti-Semitic or to resist the presence of Jews in various ways in the public conversation. So the left was actually working consciously to create favorable impressions of the Jews, not simply to make life better for Jews and reduce prejudice against Jews, but as a way of opening up some of these conversations. And a number of these films have exactly that in mind.
So the films are meant to open the conversation.
And they're meant as propaganda. They're meant to persuade. So, pop culture is not something that just descends from the sky or rises out of the earth. It's usually made by people with agendas. Now, the people who watch it don't necessarily respond to those agendas or don't respond in the way the creators expect. But it is very useful in pop culture to look at who made this, why did they make it, who were they talking to, and what did they want to communicate.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Hi, my name is Clarke Darchi. I am a graduate student here at SIPA. I have two questions, one for you, Walter, and Professor Anderson, for you another. You alluded a lot about the why was Israel important, but not why is important today. There were Stephen Walt from Harvard Kennedy School published recently another book arguing that American foreign policy helping Israel will be disaster. And he alluded a lot about the consensus of Washington, which is to focus mostly in China issues and Russia issues rather than being present in Middle East. I'd like to hear your thoughts on why should American help Israel. And Professor Anderson, you alluded a lot about the changing of Israel. Recently, Netanyahu was in New York Times interview, and one of his argument was, again, going back to the idea that Americans shouldn't deal with the Iran nuclear thing, but also he alluded a little bit something that was kind of concerning to me was that he was actively getting involved with the evangelical Christian here, which tend to be a national ethno-Christian group. I think recently I read another book by Paul D. Miller from Georgetown University arguing that some of those narrative of Republican who tend to favor the kind of evangelical Christians tend to be divisive. So statistically, I mean, looking from past 20 years, the public opinions to Israelis have declined significantly. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Have the changing of Israelis from moderately democratic presidents to kind of a little bit more right wings are changing the public opinion? Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, well, a lot of good questions embedded in that. And I got so interested in what you were saying, I forgot exactly what you were asking me about. You want to just refresh my memory?
Stephen Walt.
Oh, Stephen Walt and why Israel matters. Well, again, I'm not making recommendations about American foreign policy here. There is a debate, but I will say it does look to me as if fundamentally, from a realpolitik point of view, what's going to drive the degree of America's interest in Israel will be our interest in the Middle East. The thing is that since World War II, the core American interest in the Middle East, when you strip everything else away, has been to make sure that no other country has the ability to block Middle Eastern oil from reaching world markets on commercial terms. Whether that is a country inside the Middle East, so when Nasser tried to do it, we didn't like him. When Iran tried to do it, we didn't like them. Or a country outside the Middle East like the Soviet Union that might have tried it at one point. So, and for Israel, any country that's strong enough to do that is strong enough to be a mortal threat to Israel's existence. So in that sense, if Iran is trying to dominate the Middle East, if Turkey is trying to dominate, if Egypt, if Russia, whatever, Israel won't like it and we won't like it, and therefore, we tend to sort of work together, regardless of what we think of each other on other issues. Just as the U.S. and the Saudis don't like each other in certain ways, but cooperated, right? So the real question then is, does the Middle East matter in American foreign policy? I would tend to say yes, it does, in part because we don't need Middle Eastern oil in the U.S. anymore, but Japan, Europe, and other countries do. And so we still, I think, don't want anybody else. Anybody who could stop oil flows out of the Middle East can basically hold the world economy to blackmail, and us. So that is not acceptable. So I think but on the other hand, then you have to say, well, what's the danger? Probably Iran is the most danger, but right at the moment they have a few issues of their own. So to me, that's going to tell you how strong the American Israeli interest. Now, there's some other things. Over the years, we've developed some awfully effective weapons technology together, and that keeping that going is a significant asset. Also, keeping that out of the hands of our adversaries. So we would not like China to get a hold of some of the tech that Israel has, et cetera. So you can argue this question back and forth. My sense is that whenever it comes down to real policymakers, including Barack Obama and Joe Biden, the sense of, even though we have some difficulties and issues, there are enough things here that we have in common, we're not going to burn the bridges.
Yeah, so quickly, in a sense, an extension, any Israeli government is going to try and use whatever it can to ensure that it continues to have American support. So having developed these relationships on arms and new technologies and so forth and so on, whatever else it may be is smart, because it does implicate the United States in the continual security of Israel. But that's not the only, you're going to use whatever lever you have. So Netanyahu is perfectly comfortable saying, well, in case that doesn't work, or in case there's a hiccup there, I'm going to also have backers among the Christian Zionists, so forth. So it's a little, you can argue, if you want to, that that's very cynical on his part, but it's also running a small country and making sure that you have as many of the supports in your protector as you can. So I don't think it's a lot more complicated than that, actually. And there are lots of people, both in Israel and in the United States, who think that, this is a kind of dangerous relationship, that the Christian Zionists are interested in Israel for Christian reasons, not Israeli reasons or Jewish reasons, and at some point that's not going to be. But, most realpolitik is sort of, at some point everything's going to be different. We're talking about now. So, I think it's not that surprising that any Israeli government, I suppose it's hard to imagine some of the old socialists doing this, but basically any plausible current government of Israel is going to do basically the same thing.
So, would you say that is hurting Israel?
Is it hurting Israel?
Yeah. Like kind of siding with the evangelical Christianism, like based on Americans' favorism, because America tend to do this religious now.
Right. Maybe
go ahead.
I think there's a kind of an implicit premise. A lot of people sort of get the idea that, in a sense, Israel is dependent on the United States support, and that without the United States, Israel might not survive, would certainly be gravely weakened. I don't think that's true, and I don't think the Israelis think it's true. The American alliance works very well for them. They don't necessarily want to change it, but they've changed. Their first partner was the Soviet Union. Their second was France. Then Britain stepped in. Then France came back. And then they flipped to America. And that was when they had far fewer assets than they do now. And there is this kind of idea that American support for Israel rests on the evangelicals, the Jews, 3 or 4 other things. And so if we opponents of Israel can kind of, let's just systematically go after chopping each of these, right? And then when enough of these fall, American support will fall, and then Israel, the domino, will fall. It's just not how things work. And to me, it's a kind of an illustration, in some sense, of the strategic bankruptcy of some Israeli opponents who have a difficult time wrapping their heads around just how strong the state has become, how durable it's likely to be.
But I also, if I may, I don't think it's dangerous. I don't know why that would not be a mutually satisfying relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Zach Cravine. I'm a first-year CEPA student. I think my question bounces off that nicely. So we've spoken about this phenomenon of increasing support for Israel on the American right and the Republican Party, whereas the opposite is happening on the left in the Democratic Party. I'm sure we've seen the polls of younger Jews, my generation, feeling less and less connected to Israel as the years go on. I think that the Israel of my parents and Tebi, the Six-Day War, Israel as the underdog. That's not the Israel that my generation is encountering. We see the number of deaths following the escalation of violence being overwhelmingly one-sided on the Palestinian side. And so as such, I'm just wondering if that trade-off, perhaps it is not a negative for Israel if the United States no longer supports Israel, but the United States supporting Israel, do you think that that trade-off bodes poorly for the sustainability of it moving forward?
Wait, could you?
The last part I didn't quite understand the question.
The trade-off of younger left-leaning Jews
will
far
impact
less,
American support.
Does that threaten U.S. support of Israel moving forward?
Okay. I don't think so very much. I mean, part of my book is that American Jews have been a lot less central to the story of American policy than American Jews will think. That there's a kind of a sort of critics of Israel and American Jews often, I found writing this book, have colluded in creating a kind of legend. A great example is, there's, Israel's fate hangs in the balance. Harry Truman is deciding what to do. He refuses to speak to all the big Jewish leaders. But then Eddie Jacobson, a little Jewish haberdasher, as Truman's old friend, comes in and like Queen Esther in the Bible, he goes to the moody Gentile ruler and says, "Save my people." And Truman listens and Israel is saved. And this shows that the American Jewish community has saved Israel. And even the littlest Jew from the tiniest town can, this is a kind of almost a foundation myth for parts of the American Jewish community. The trouble is, while it's true that Eddie Jacobson went in and met with Truman, and he did agree to see Weizmann. He says to him, "All right, you bald-headed son of a bitch, you win, I'll see him." All right. After he sees Weizmann, Truman doesn't change his policy. Nothing happens. And so, but again, just in the way that I think John Mearsheimer in the Israel Lobby book, Walter Mearsheimer, actually quote AIPAC fundraising literature and say, "See, the Jews do run America. Look at what AIPAC is telling its backers that it's responsible for." Even they admit it. But again, pro-Israel and pro-Israel Jews and anti-Israelis have created a legend. So I actually think Jews are 2.4% of the population. If the Jewish
the United States.
Yes. If Jewish support for Israel drops 10%, 20%, and I think the real issue in terms of the Jewish community is that young Jews are less affiliated with anything. They go to synagogue less. Even if they're angry at Israel, they don't think about it as much as their parents did.
I do like a good bacon, egg, and cheese.
Well, that's I think some of your parents and grandparents also. Although I have to say, I'm sort of surprised. I see people in Brooklyn who who wouldn't eat, think kosher is ridiculous, but spend at least as much time, thinking about what they eat and have at least as complex rituals about what I eat and what I don't eat as their grandmother. But look, I think the Jewish community in America is facing fundamentally a question of assimilation and what is its future? What is the future of the secular Jewish community, the Orthodox community? Are they together? Are they separate? I can't tell you that that part of the fate of the Jewish community I have no idea about. But I think that the declining either interest or support of young Jews for the state of Israel reflects a difference in values. Look, Herzl's message to the Jews of Europe, Theodor Herzl's message, basically is that liberalism won't save you. That if you trust to human rights campaigners, if you trust to liberal politicians and constitutions, they're going to murder all of you, right? And basically, Israeli Jews, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, are descended from people for whom Herzl was right. And American Jews are descended much more from people for whom Herzl was wrong, all right? And so when American Jews see a political problem, the majority tend to think that more liberalism in some way is the answer, right? Israeli Jews don't see it that way. So the communities are moving apart, and not just on specific high-profile issues. Religiosity is another. There are all kinds of things that are happening. It's the fate of Jewish people. We'll see what happens.
Understood.
Lisa, did you want to jump in on that?
I actually agree that I think, and this goes back to the Christian Zionist question and so forth. I think the kind of support in popular culture for Israel is not dependent on young Jews. That said, I think the 2.4% is a little bit misleading because New York is the biggest Israeli city. Not to say, so there are pockets that are very important in terms of whether the support continues. That said, I think overall, there is a fair amount of support for Israel outside the Jewish community.
It's interesting, at every point from the Jews have a divine right to the Holy Land even more than they've got, and they should get more, to Zionism is a fundamentally racist and illegitimate aspiration. From those two ends of the spectrum, if you look at America, there are Jews and non-Jews at every single one of those points. And at every one of those points, there are more non-Jews than Jews, right? Yeah. So it's, and one of the most American things about American Jews are their attitudes toward Israel. And to me, it's actually quite remarkable how much American Jews, the more I have studied the political activities and activism of American Jews, the more American they look to me.
See, it's a book about America.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more, and here comes the State Department.
I've been
buried
outed.
any memos lately?
First of all, thank you so much for speaking, and I really look forward to reading your book. I totally relate to that anecdote about the State Department and generally at the working level, a sense of, oh my God, isn't the world hectic enough? Do we have to, really make big, bold statements? But I worked under the Trump administration in two different capacities. One in Abu Dhabi, supporting the frequent travel of Jared Kushner in pursuit of the Abraham Accords. And then here at the United Nations in New York, under Secretary Pompeo's snapback, ultimately unsuccessful snapback of Iran sanctions. And I felt that obviously the Abraham Accords was very germane to Israel, and it seemed that snapback in a way, Secretary Pompeo was very focused on Israel, and even in his conduct of that policy. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the evolution of Israel policy within the Trump administration, because it felt that there were kind of not two poles, because they weren't polar opposites, but it felt that both Kushner and Pompeo were like different poles in the same tent.
You're referring to snapback of Iran?
Yeah.
Iran sanctions,
yeah, right.
UN sanctions on Iran.
Just clarify.
Well, I think, the key way to understand the Trump administration is to study the history of the Medici court. Factions, poisonings, and it continues in exile at Mar-a-Lago. So backstabbings. So what is interesting, however, is that one of the things that virtually all the factions in the Trump administration agreed on was that being pro-Israel is good. So Pompeo and Kushner, as far as I can tell, really didn't like each other very much and didn't work cooperatively. No Secretary of State would like a president's son-in-law horning in on big diplomatic things. It's institutionally it's kind of weird. I suppose not since Bobby Kennedy was his brother's attorney general have we had this level of nepotism in the federal government. And any professional would find that difficult. But the thing is that, again, what they're all doing is they're competing for Trump's favor. And they're doing it by showing I'm more pro-Israel than so-and-so, or I'm getting more done for Israel. Now, I would add that there's a special resonance for Iran in the Trump administration, partly because Trump did pull out of the JCPOA. And the JCPOA, that's the Iran nuclear deal, really did become a kind of a thing that one of his chosen policies that he really wanted to highlight. So in working on the snapback, Pompeo was trying to deliver for the boss on one of his priorities. The Abraham Accords, again, for Trump's evangelical base, that's a huge thing. Again, I read about this some in the book. Trump's position, you have to understand, Trump saw the Republican establishment as his enemy. He was not wrong. They are his enemy. And he saw himself as the little boy saying the emperor has no clothes. The establishment has no clothes. All the experts have no clothes. And I'm the only one with the courage to tell you and the wisdom to tell you. And so on Israel, it worked really well for him on certain things because he for 25 years, they don't move the capital to Israel, to Jerusalem, even with the embassy, even though it's the law. And presidents actually would run for election saying, I can't believe my predecessor wouldn't do it. I'll do it. And then they get in and they don't do it. And all the experts said, oh, my goodness, if you move the embassy to Jerusalem, the entire Middle East will erupt in flames. Every living Secretary of State signs a big statement and all of this. For Trump, this is such a godsend because he then moves and essentially nothing happens. And in fact, he later signs, all these Abraham Accord agreements. So this is like Trump perfection, Trump heaven right here. The experts were wrong. They were lying to you. And he did it, he knew it and did it. That's what he lives for. All right? And it worked really well with the base because it said to the base, yes! Our instinct is don't ever listen to all those horrible people with all of those degrees and credentials and experience because they're just lying to us. The truth is obvious, right? And that's how Trump used Israel policy to defeat his enemies in the party and bind the base closely to it. It's more dramatic than what most other presidents do, but in general, that is an objective for all presidents in their Israel policy, is to use it to frustrate their opponents and charge up their supporters.
Thank you. I think we'll wrap it up on that point. Just want to thank both of you, thank the audience for terrific questions, and thought that was a very enlightening conversation. And this is a conversation that will continue because this book was the start of a conversation, not the ending of one. So thanks, everybody.
I'm not writing a sequel.
No, I didn't imply that.